January 17, 1945. The Ardennes, Belgium. The snow fell in silence. It was the kind of silence that follows gunfire, heavy, expectant, waiting to be broken again. Along the frozen ridgeline overlooking the village of Sankt Vith, a column of German prisoners shuffled westward through the drifts, their field-gray uniforms caked with ice and mud, their breath forming desperate clouds in the sub-zero air. They had been fighting for 32 days without rest. The Ardennes offensive, Hitler's final gamble to split the Allied armies and recapture Antwerp, had collapsed into a grinding hell of encirclement and retreat. Obergefreiter Klaus Hartmann was 23 years old, though his face belonged to someone much older. His boots were held together with wire. His stomach had not known fullness in 6 weeks. Around his neck hung an empty canteen, and in his pack, wrapped in oilcloth, were 3 photographs. His mother in the garden at Lübeck, his younger sister on confirmation day, and one of himself in fresh uniform from 1943, smiling with certainty into a future that no longer existed. He had expected to be shot. That was what the propaganda had taught him. The Americans were gangsters, capitalist barbarians who would show no mercy to soldiers of the Reich. Minister Goebbels had been clear on this point. The Jew-controlled democracies had no honor, no discipline, no respect for the warrior spirit. Surrender meant torture, execution, or worse, transport to the gulags of the Soviet East, where German blood would be worked into the Siberian permafrost until nothing remained. But as the column halted outside a hastily erected American field depot near Liege, what Klaus Hartmann encountered was not violence. It was a chocolate bar. An American soldier, young, perhaps 19, with an open face beneath his helmet, stepped forward holding a cardboard box. He moved down the line of prisoners, placing something into each man's outstretched hands. When he reached Hartmann, their eyes met for a fraction of a second. The American said nothing. He simply handed over a Hershey's tropical bar and moved on. Hartmann stared at the brown wrapper. His fingers, blackened with frostbite, could barely grip it. Around him, other prisoners were already tearing into theirs, some weeping openly, others staring in confusion at this incomprehensible act. An SS Unterscharführer, 2 men down, threw his into the snow, spat, and turned away. But most ate, slowly, reverently, as though the sweetness on their tongues was dissolving something more than hunger. In that moment, something shifted, not loudly, not with fanfare or declaration, but in the quiet space between expectation and reality. A crack appeared in the architecture of belief. This is the story of how kindness became a weapon. The Ardennes offensive began on December 16, 1944, along an 85-mile front stretching from southern Belgium into Luxembourg. Hitler had committed over 400,000 men, 1,300 tanks, and the last reserves of the Luftwaffe to what he codenamed Wacht am Rhein, Watch on the Rhine. The plan was audacious, perhaps delusional. Punch through the thinly defended American lines in the forested Ardennes, drive northwest to Antwerp, encircle and destroy 4 Allied armies, and force the Western powers to negotiate a separate peace. For the young soldiers of the Wehrmacht and Waffen-SS who assembled in the frozen forests that December, the offensive represented something larger than strategy. It was mythology made operational. These men had grown up under the Third Reich. They had been shaped by its schools, its rallies, its relentless machinery of indoctrination. They had been taught that Germany was encircled by enemies, that the Aryan race was engaged in an existential struggle for survival, that weakness was extinction and strength was destiny. And they had been taught, above all, to fear and despise the Americans. The United States, in Nazi ideology, represented everything corrupt about modernity. It was a mongrel nation, polluted by racial mixing, controlled by Jewish financiers, addicted to decadent luxuries. Its soldiers were soft, undisciplined, more interested in jazz music and Hollywood films than in the hard truths of war. Germany, by contrast, was pure, disciplined, forged in the crucible of suffering. The German soldier was lean, hardened, superior. The American was fat, lazy, weak. This was not merely propaganda for public consumption. It was woven into military training, into unit cohesion, into the very psychology of endurance. When a soldier is cold, hungry, and far from home, belief becomes fuel. The conviction that your cause is righteous, that your enemy is contemptible, that history will vindicate your sacrifice. These are the stories that keep men moving forward when every rational instinct screams retreat. But belief is fragile when it meets contradiction. The first days of the offensive seemed to confirm everything the Germans had been taught. American units, caught off guard, fell back in confusion. Entire regiments were surrounded. At Schnee-Eifel, over 8,000 U.S. soldiers surrendered in one of the largest capitulations of American forces in the European theater. German tank columns pushed deep into Belgium. In some places, they advanced 40 miles in 3 days. Lieutenant Friedrich Weber, commanding a reconnaissance platoon of the 12th SS Panzer Division, wrote in his diary on December 18, "The Americans run like rabbits. They leave behind everything: weapons, food, vehicles. We captured a supply dump yesterday containing more tinned meat and cigarettes than our entire regiment has seen in a year. The men are eating American rations and laughing. Perhaps the Führer was right. Perhaps they have no stomach for this." But the laughter did not last. By December 22, the weather cleared, and the Allied air forces returned. American artillery, previously silent due to poor visibility, began to speak again with systematic fury. The German advance, stretched thin and running out of fuel, ground to a halt. At Bastogne, the encircled 101st Airborne Division refused to surrender, and the German forces lacked the strength to dislodge them. Patton's Third Army pivoted north with a speed that astonished even Allied commanders, smashing into the southern flank of the German Bulge. The offensive stalled, then it reversed. By early January, the Wehrmacht was in full retreat. Units that had marched west with songs and confidence now stumbled east in disarray, harried by fighter-bombers, shelled by artillery, freezing in temperatures that plunged to -15 degrees Celsius. Supply lines collapsed. Wounded men were left behind. Horses died by the hundreds, their frozen carcasses littering the roads. And the men began to surrender, not in ones or twos, but in companies, battalions, entire regiments. In the first week of January alone, American forces captured over 20,000 German prisoners in the Ardennes sector. These were not the broken remnants of 1918, the starving scarecrows of a collapsing empire. These were soldiers of the supposed master race, the vanguard of the 1,000-year Reich, and they were laying down their arms in unprecedented numbers. What they found on the other side of that surrender shattered the foundation of everything they believed. Prisoner-of-war camps in the European theater of operations were not designed for comfort. The Geneva Convention mandated basic standards: shelter, food, medical care, protection from violence. But in the chaos of the Ardennes winter, even these minimums were difficult to meet. Tens of thousands of prisoners flooded into hastily prepared camps in Belgium and France, overwhelming administrative capacity. Tents were erected in frozen fields. Barbed wire perimeters were strung in haste. Guards, many of them recent replacements, struggled to maintain order. Yet even in these improvised conditions, something unprecedented occurred. The prisoners were fed, not lavishly, not with abundance, but fed nonetheless, and fed better than they had eaten in months. U.S. Army rations, designed to sustain soldiers in active combat, provided approximately 4,000 calories per day. Prisoners received reduced but still substantial portions: bread, canned meat, powdered milk, coffee, sugar. To men who had been subsisting on black bread and watery soup, who had watched their rations shrink month by month as the Reich's logistics system disintegrated, the American field rations seemed almost obscene in their generosity. Jeffrader Anton Mueller, captured near Hufeleis on January 9, later recalled in a 1947 interview with American historians, "The first meal they gave us was better than anything I had eaten since 1943. There was white bread, real white bread, not sawdust. There was meat, not just the smell of meat, but actual pieces you could chew. And there was so much of it. I thought it was a trick. I thought they were fattening us for something worse. But the next day, they fed us again. And the day after, every day, I began to wonder if everything we had been told was a lie." The food was not the only shock. American guards, by and large, did not abuse their prisoners. There were exceptions, of course, isolated incidents of rough treatment, particularly in the immediate aftermath of capture when emotions ran high. But systematic brutality, the kind that German propaganda had predicted, did not materialize. Instead, prisoners found themselves guarded by men who seemed almost indifferent to the ideology of the war, who offered cigarettes through the wire, who shrugged when prisoners asked why they were not being shot. Oberjeffrader Paul Schmidt, a veteran of the Eastern Front, found this incomprehensible. In Russia, he later wrote, "If you were captured, you knew what would happen. Everyone knew. The Soviets hated us, and we hated them. It was mutual, total. But the Americans, they acted like we were just people, inconvenient people, perhaps, but people. They processed us like bureaucrats, not like warriors. Where was the rage? Where was the desire for revenge? We had killed their friends. We had invaded their allies. And yet they gave us food and blankets. I could not understand it." This cognitive dissonance, the gap between expectation and experience, created a psychological crisis for many prisoners. The Nazi worldview was totalizing. It explained everything. Why Germany was at war, why Germans were suffering, why the enemy was evil, why victory was both necessary and inevitable. But if the enemy was not evil, if the Americans were not the sadistic barbarians described in the propaganda, then what did that say about the propaganda itself? And if the propaganda was false about the enemy, what else might it be false about? The chocolate bar, in this context, became something more than a simple comfort. It became a symbol. The U.S. Army had been distributing chocolate to its soldiers since the beginning of the war. The Hershey Company, under contract with the Quartermaster Corps, produced two types of chocolate bars for military use. The standard Ration D bar was designed to be unappetizing, hard, bitter, heat-resistant, so that soldiers would consume it only in emergencies rather than as a snack. But the tropical bar, developed for use in hot climates, was slightly more palatable, and both types were distributed widely throughout the European theater. For American soldiers, chocolate was mundane, almost banal. It was simply part of the standard-issue ration, something to eat on the march or trade for other goods. But for German prisoners, many of whom had not tasted chocolate in years, it represented something extraordinary. Chocolate required sugar, cocoa, milk, resources that the Reich could no longer afford to allocate to soldiers, much less prisoners. Chocolate was a luxury, a marker of abundance, a substance that belonged to the world before the war. In the memory of many German soldiers, chocolate was associated with childhood, with peacetime, with normalcy. And here were the Americans, handing it out to prisoners by the thousands. Lieutenant Dieter Cross, a platoon leader in the 26th Volksgrenadier Division, described his first encounter with American chocolate in a letter smuggled out of a POW camp in March 1945. They gave us chocolate as if it were nothing, as if they had so much they could afford to give it away to men who had been trying to kill them a week ago. I tried to imagine our army doing the same, giving chocolate to Russian prisoners, and I could not. We barely had chocolate for ourselves, and yet the Americans, these supposedly soft and decadent people, had enough to share. What kind of nation was this? What kind of war were we fighting? The question haunted him. To understand the depth of this psychological rupture, one must first understand the totality of Nazi indoctrination. The Third Reich did not merely govern Germany. It sought to reshape the German soul. From the earliest years of childhood, citizens were immersed in a worldview that divided humanity into hierarchies of worth. The Aryan race was at the pinnacle, destined to rule. Jews, Slavs, Africans, and others were subhuman, fit only for exploitation or extermination. Democracy was a Jewish conspiracy. Capitalism was a tool of racial decline. Communism was a Slavic disease. And America, that hybrid experiment across the Atlantic, was the ultimate expression of racial chaos and moral decay. This was not subtle propaganda. It was taught in schools, reinforced in the Hitler Youth, dramatized in films, and repeated in every newspaper, every radio broadcast, every public speech. By the time a young German man was conscripted into the Wehrmacht, he had spent his entire conscious life absorbing these lessons. The ideology was not something external, something he could take or leave. It was woven into his identity. Consider the case of Hans Eugen, a 20-year-old conscript from Bavaria, captured during the retreat from the Bulge. In a series of interviews conducted by U.S. Army intelligence officers in February 1945, Eugen described his education. "We learned in school that America was a nation of criminals and Jews, that its wealth came from exploitation, that its people had no culture, no history, no soul. We were told that American soldiers were cowards who would not fight without overwhelming material superiority. We were told that if we were captured, we would be tortured or sent to camps in Siberia." I believed all of this. Why would I not? It came from teachers, from officers, from the government. I had no reason to doubt. But then he encountered the reality. The first American I spoke to was a Feldwebel. No, they call them sergeants. He was from a place called Iowa. I did not know where that was. He asked me if I wanted water. I thought it was a trick, but he gave me water, and it was clean. Then he asked if I was wounded, and when I showed him my hand, I had frostbite. He called a medic. An American medic treated me. He bandaged my fingers and gave me a cigarette. I kept waiting for the punishment, for the cruelty we had been promised. It never came. Instead, they gave me food. They gave me a blanket. They put me on a truck and drove me to a camp. And at the camp, they gave me more food. I thought I was going insane. Nothing was as it was supposed to be. This was the pattern repeated across tens of thousands of individual experiences. The dissonance between ideology and reality created a kind of mental vertigo. For some prisoners, the response was denial. They convinced themselves that the kindness was temporary, a trick, a prelude to something worse. They clung to the propaganda, because letting it go meant confronting the possibility that they had been lied to about everything. But for others, the cracks widened into chasms. The U.S. Army did not treat prisoners well out of pure altruism. There were practical and strategic reasons for adhering to the Geneva Convention, and in many cases, exceeding its requirements. Humane treatment of prisoners encouraged further surrenders, reducing American casualties. It maintained moral legitimacy, distinguishing the Allies from the Axis in the eyes of neutral nations and occupied populations. It also served a long-term purpose. A well-treated prisoner was more likely to cooperate during interrogation, more likely to accept re-education, more likely to become a productive citizen in a post-war Germany aligned with the West rather than the Soviet Union. But for the individual soldiers who guarded the camps, who distributed the rations, who offered cigarettes and kind words, the motivations were often simpler and more human. Private James O'Connor, a guard at a POW camp near Liege, later wrote in his memoir, "I didn't think of them as Nazis. I thought of them as kids, scared, cold kids who looked like they hadn't had a decent meal in months. Yeah, some of them were hard cases, true believers who glared at you like they wanted to kill you. But most of them just looked relieved, relieved to be out of the war, relieved to be somewhere warm, relieved to be eating. My sergeant told us, treat them like you'd want your brother treated if he got captured. That made sense to me, so I did." This attitude, pragmatic decency rather than ideological fervor, was itself a revelation to German prisoners. They had been taught that ideological commitment was the highest virtue, that a soldier's worth was measured by his fanaticism. Yet here were American soldiers who seemed to care more about baseball scores and letters from home than about the grand struggle between fascism and democracy. They performed their duties competently, but without passion. They were not driven by hatred or zeal. They simply wanted the war to end so they could go home. For prisoners steeped in the totalitarian mindset, this casualness was almost insulting. Where was the martial spirit? Where was the discipline? How could these unmotivated, ideologically indifferent soldiers be winning the war? The answer gradually became clear. They were winning precisely because they were not fanatics. They were citizens, not zealots. They fought not because they worshipped the state, but because they believed in something larger and more abstract. In the idea that people should be free to live without fear, to speak without persecution, to build lives of their own choosing. This was not a philosophy that lent itself to slogans or grand speeches. It was quieter, more modest, but also in its own way more powerful. Because it was real, by February 1945, over 150,000 German prisoners were held in American and British camps in Western Europe. The flow of captives accelerated as the Allies pushed into Germany itself. In March, the Rhine crossings brought another wave of surrenders. In April, entire divisions laid down their arms without firing a shot. The U.S. Army established a formal program of re-education for prisoners of war. The program, administered by the Psychological Warfare Division and later by the Office of the Provost Marshal General, sought to expose prisoners to democratic ideas, to counter Nazi indoctrination, and to prepare them for reintegration into a post-war society. Prisoners were shown films, given access to uncensored newspapers, and encouraged to attend lectures on American history and government. The most cooperative prisoners were separated into special camps, where they received additional privileges and training. The effectiveness of these programs varied. Some prisoners remained unrepentant Nazis, resistant to any challenge to their beliefs. But many others, particularly the younger conscripts, began to change. The combination of humane treatment, material abundance, and exposure to alternative ideas created an opening for doubt. And doubt, once admitted, grew. Unteroffizier Erich Schneider, captured in the Rhineland in March 1945, described his experience in a re-education camp. "They showed us films about America, not propaganda films, or at least they did not seem like propaganda. Just ordinary films. Films about farms, about factories, about schools. What struck me was the wealth, the casual, everyday wealth. People had cars. Families had cars. In Germany, only the rich or the party elite had cars. But in America, it seemed like everyone did. And the food. My God, the food. They showed us a film about a supermarket, and I thought it was a lie. No place could have that much food. But then I thought about the rations we had been receiving, and I began to wonder." The material abundance of the United States was, in many ways, the most devastating counterargument to Nazi ideology. The Reich had promised prosperity through conquest, through the domination of inferior peoples and the seizure of their resources. But America had achieved prosperity through industry, innovation, and a political system that, for all its flaws, allowed ordinary people to participate in economic life. The American soldiers who guarded the camps were not aristocrats or party members. They were farmers, mechanics, shopkeepers, common men who in Germany would have had no voice, no power, no prospects beyond obedience. And yet they had enough chocolate to give away to their enemies. One of the most poignant symbols of this cultural collision was the K-ration, the individual daily combat ration issued to U.S. soldiers. Each K-ration package contained breakfast, lunch, and dinner meals, along with cigarettes, matches, chewing gum, toilet paper, and a can opener. The meals included items like cheese, crackers, canned meat, fruit bars, and instant coffee. To American soldiers, K-rations were notoriously unpopular, considered bland and monotonous. To German prisoners, they were a revelation. Feldwebel Otto Lang, a supply sergeant from the 12th Volksgrenadier Division, later wrote, "They gave us the same rations their own soldiers ate. The same, not less, not worse, but the same. I could not believe it. In our army, the officers ate better than the men, and the men ate better than the prisoners. That was natural, the order of things, but the Americans fed us what they fed themselves. What kind of army does that? What kind of people?" The question was not rhetorical. It reflected a genuine confusion about the nature of American society. In the German military hierarchy, rank determined not just authority but access to resources. Officers had better food, better quarters, better medical care. This was justified by the ideology of leadership. The idea that those who commanded deserved more because they bore greater responsibility. But the American system, at least as the prisoners experienced it, seemed to operate on a different principle: that all people, regardless of rank or status, had a baseline of dignity that must be respected. This was not idealism. It was codified in military regulations and enforced, however imperfectly, throughout the command structure. The U.S. Army understood that morale and cohesion depended on a sense of fairness, that soldiers would fight harder if they believed they were valued. The same logic extended to prisoners. Treat them like human beings, and they would be less likely to resist, more likely to cooperate, and eventually more likely to embrace the values of the society that had defeated them. It was pragmatism disguised as kindness, or perhaps kindness justified by pragmatism. Either way, it worked. In April 1945, as the Allied armies drove deeper into Germany, they began to liberate the concentration camps. The images that emerged, the skeletal prisoners, the mass graves, the gas chambers, shocked the world. For German prisoners of war held in Allied camps, the revelations were devastating. Many refused to believe the reports. They insisted the photographs were faked, that the stories were Allied propaganda designed to justify the war. But the evidence was overwhelming. Soldiers were forced to watch films of the camps. Newspapers circulated with undeniable documentation. And some prisoners, those who had served on the Eastern Front or in occupied territories, admitted quietly that they had known, that they had seen, that they had perhaps even participated. The contrast between their treatment in American hands and the horrors perpetrated by their own regime could not have been starker. Obergefreiter Klaus Hartmann, the young soldier who had received the chocolate bar in January, was among a group of prisoners shown footage from Bergen-Belsen in late April. In a letter written years later, he described the experience. "I watched the film in silence. Around me some men wept. Others shouted that it was lies. I said nothing. I could not speak, because I realized in that moment that we had been the evil ones, not the Americans, us. We had been told we were fighting for civilization, for Europe, for the future. But we had been fighting for that, for those camps, for those corpses, and the Americans, whom we had despised as weak and decadent, had stopped us. They had every right to hate us, to punish us, to take revenge. Instead, they had given us chocolate. The chocolate bar, which he had saved and carried with him through the months of captivity, had become a kind of talisman. He could not explain why he had kept it. Perhaps because it represented the moment when his understanding of the world began to shift. Perhaps because it was a tangible piece of evidence that the enemy was not what he had been taught. Perhaps because, in a time when everything else had proven false, the sweetness of that chocolate remained real. The transformation of German prisoners of war was not uniform or universal. Thousands remained committed Nazis, clinging to their beliefs even in the face of overwhelming evidence. Some returned to Germany after the war and continued to espouse fascist ideas, forming the nucleus of extremist movements that persisted for decades. But many others underwent a profound change. They became advocates for democracy, voices for reconciliation, witnesses to the dangers of totalitarianism. One of the most striking examples was Lieutenant Friedrich Weber, the reconnaissance officer who had exulted in the early successes of the Ardennes offensive. After his capture in February 1945, Weber was sent to a re-education camp in France, where he encountered American officers who spoke fluent German and engaged him in long conversations about politics, history, and philosophy. Initially resistant, Weber gradually began to question his assumptions. He read Kant and Goethe, philosophers he had studied in school but never truly understood because they had been filtered through the lens of Nazi ideology. He attended lectures on the American Constitution and the principles of individual liberty, and he observed the behavior of his captors, noting the absence of cruelty, the respect for rules, the fundamental decency that permeated even the mundane interactions of daily life. In his post-war memoir, published in 1952, Weber wrote, "I had believed that strength came from discipline, from hierarchy, from the willingness to obey without question. But the Americans showed me a different kind of strength. It was the strength of a people who trusted each other, who did not need a dictator to tell them what to think or how to live. They were not perfect. They had their own injustices, their own failures, but they had something we had lost. The belief that ordinary people could govern themselves. That was why they won the war, not because they had more tanks or planes, though they did, but because their soldiers knew what they were fighting for, and they believed it was worth defending. We, on the other hand, had been fighting for a lie, and once I realized that, I could no longer be the person I had been." Weber returned to Germany in 1947 and became a teacher, dedicating the rest of his life to educating young Germans about the dangers of fascism and the value of democratic institutions. He was not alone. Across West Germany, former soldiers and officers, transformed by their experiences as prisoners, became leaders in the post-war reconstruction, building a new society that rejected the totalitarianism of the past. The role of food in this transformation cannot be overstated. Hunger is one of the most primal and persistent forms of suffering. It degrades the body, saps the will, and narrows the mind to a single, desperate focus: survival. For German soldiers in the final months of the war, hunger was a constant companion. Rations had been cut repeatedly as the Reich's agricultural and logistical systems collapsed. Soldiers foraged for food, stole from civilians, and bartered their personal possessions for a crust of bread. To be hungry is to be vulnerable, to be diminished, to lose a sense of one's own humanity. And then they were captured, and they were fed. The act of feeding an enemy is deeply symbolic. It is an acknowledgement that even in war, even when killing is justified, there are limits to what can be done to another human being. It is a declaration that the war is not total, that civilization persists, that the rules still apply. For prisoners who had been taught that the Americans were savages, being fed by them was a form of cognitive dissonance so severe that it could not be ignored. Jeffrader Martin Fischer, captured near Cologne in March 1945, later reflected, "They gave us soup, hot soup. I had not had hot food in weeks. I sat in the mud with my bowl, and I cried. Not because the soup was particularly good, though it was, but because I realized that they cared enough to make it hot. They could have given us cold rations, and we would have eaten them gratefully. But they took the time to heat the soup. That small act, that tiny gesture of care, broke something inside me. I had been prepared to die for the Führer, but I was not prepared for kindness. The soup, like the chocolate, became a symbol. It represented not just sustenance, but a fundamentally different way of seeing the world. In the Nazi ideology, strength meant hardness, ruthlessness, the willingness to inflict suffering without hesitation. But the Americans demonstrated a different kind of strength: the ability to show compassion even to those who did not deserve it, to uphold principles even when it was inconvenient, to treat enemies with dignity, because dignity was not something that could be earned or lost. It simply was. This was a radical idea for men raised in a culture that divided humanity into masters and slaves, winners and losers, the strong and the weak. The notion that all people possessed inherent worth, independent of their race or ideology or utility to the state, was so foreign as to be almost incomprehensible. But it was also, once understood, profoundly liberating. Not all interactions between American soldiers and German prisoners were marked by kindness. There were incidents of violence, of abuse, of scores settled in the shadows beyond official oversight. War is not a morality play, and the men who fought it were not saints. Some American soldiers, particularly those who had lost friends to German bullets or witnessed the horrors of the concentration camps, felt no compassion for their captives. Some guards were indifferent, others harsh, and a few actively cruel. But these incidents, while real, were exceptions rather than the rule. What defined the American approach to prisoners of war was not perfection but consistency. The vast majority of German prisoners were treated in accordance with the Geneva Convention. They were sheltered, fed, given medical care, and protected from violence. This consistency stood in stark contrast to the chaotic brutality that characterized the Eastern Front, where prisoners on both sides faced torture, starvation, and execution. Oberst Heinrich Müller, a regimental commander captured in the Ruhr Pocket in April 1945, later wrote, "I had fought in Russia from 1941 to 1943. I knew what happened to prisoners there. When I was captured by the Americans, I expected the same. I expected to be beaten, interrogated with brutality, perhaps shot. Instead, they took my pistol, gave me a cigarette, and put me in a truck. At the collection point, I was processed like a piece of paperwork. Name, rank, serial number. No threats, no violence, just bureaucracy. It was surreal. In Russia, war was personal, visceral, a struggle for survival in which all rules were suspended. But the Americans treated war like a job. They did their job, and they expected you to do yours. And once your job, fighting, was over, you were just another problem to be managed. It was cold in its efficiency, but it was not cruel, and that distinction mattered. This bureaucratic efficiency, often criticized as a lack of passion or commitment, was in fact one of the great strengths of the American military system. It created predictability, reduced arbitrary violence, and ensured that even in the chaos of war, certain standards were maintained. For German prisoners, this predictability was itself a form of reassurance. They might not understand the Americans, might not agree with their values, but they could trust that the rules would be followed. And trust, once established, opened the door to persuasion. In the final weeks of the war, as Germany collapsed, the American army faced an overwhelming flood of prisoners. In some cases, entire divisions surrendered en masse, creating logistical nightmares for commanders who had to feed, house, and process hundreds of thousands of men. Improvised camps were set up in open fields, surrounded by barbed wire but lacking adequate shelter. Conditions in these camps were harsh, particularly in the so-called Rheinwassenlager, the Rhine meadow camps, where prisoners slept in the open, suffered from exposure and disease, and received reduced rations due to supply shortages. These conditions, while grim, were not the result of deliberate cruelty, but of logistical overload. The sheer number of prisoners, over 3 million by May 1945, exceeded all planning assumptions. The Allied supply system, stretched thin by the demands of combat operations, struggled to provide for both the advancing armies and the masses of captives. Food was rationed, shelter was scarce, medical care was inadequate. Yet even in these desperate circumstances, the fundamental principle of humane treatment persisted. Prisoners were not systematically starved. They were not executed. They were not subjected to forced labor under lethal conditions. Conditions improved as the fighting ended and supply lines stabilized. By the summer of 1945, most prisoners were housed in more permanent camps, receiving adequate food and medical attention. For German prisoners who had expected extermination, even these imperfect conditions were a form of mercy. Gefreiter Ludwig Braun, held in a Rhine meadow camp in April, later recalled, "It was cold. It was wet. We slept in the mud, but we were alive. Every morning, I woke up surprised to still be breathing. The guards told us the war was over, that Hitler was dead, that Germany had surrendered. I did not believe them, but it did not matter. I was alive, and every day they gave us something to eat. Not much, but something. That was more than I had expected." The expectation of death, so carefully cultivated by Nazi propaganda, made even minimal decency seem extraordinary. This was one of the great ironies of the war. By teaching their soldiers to fear the enemy so completely, the Nazi regime ensured that any deviation from that fear would have a disproportionate psychological impact. A chocolate bar was not just a chocolate bar. It was evidence of a world the propaganda insisted could not exist. By the summer of 1945, the war in Europe was over. Germany lay in ruins, occupied by the Allied armies, its population traumatized and demoralized. The question of what to do with millions of former soldiers and party members became one of the central challenges of the post-war period. The Western Allies, particularly the United States, pursued a policy of denazification combined with economic reconstruction. The goal was to purge the most egregious war criminals, while reintegrating the broader population into a democratic society. This required not just legal tribunals, but a cultural and psychological transformation. Germans had to be persuaded that democracy was not only preferable to fascism, but possible, that a nation could be governed by laws rather than by leaders, by consent rather than by force. The experience of prisoners of war played a crucial role in this transformation. Hundreds of thousands of German soldiers returned home from American captivity with first-hand knowledge of how a democratic society functioned. They had seen that Americans were not monsters. They had experienced a system that, while imperfect, valued rules over arbitrary power. They had learned that prosperity did not require conquest, that strength did not mean cruelty, that a nation could be powerful without being totalitarian. This knowledge became a seed that, over time, grew into the Federal Republic of Germany, a stable, democratic state integrated into the Western Alliance. The contrast with the Soviet-occupied East, where returned prisoners faced suspicion and persecution, could not have been sharper. Those who had been held by the Soviets returned traumatized, broken, and often died young. Those who had been held by the Americans returned with stories of abundance, fairness, and hope. Former Lieutenant Dieter Cross, the officer who had marveled at American chocolate, became a member of the West German Parliament in the 1950s. In a speech delivered in 1958, he reflected on his transformation. "When I was captured, I was a soldier of the Third Reich. I believed in the Führer. I believed in the superiority of the German race. I believed that our enemies were subhuman. And then I was given a chocolate bar by an American soldier who looked at me not with hatred, but with something like pity. That moment changed my life. It forced me to confront the lies I had been told, the lies I had believed, the lies I had lived. I am grateful for that chocolate bar. It was the beginning of my freedom." The symbolic power of food, of chocolate, of the simple act of feeding an enemy, extended far beyond individual transformations. It became part of the larger narrative of the Cold War, a demonstration that the American way of life, capitalism, democracy, individual liberty, was not only morally superior, but also materially superior to the alternatives. While the Soviet Union imposed harsh discipline and scarcity on its sphere of influence, the United States offered prosperity and freedom. This was not mere propaganda. It was rooted in observable reality. The Marshall Plan, launched in 1948, poured billions of dollars into European reconstruction, including West Germany. The aid was not purely altruistic. It served American strategic interests by creating stable, prosperous allies, but it was also genuinely generous. Food, machinery, raw materials, and technical assistance flowed into Europe, helping to rebuild economies and societies devastated by war. The contrast with Soviet policy in Eastern Europe, where resources were extracted rather than invested, could not have been clearer. Germans in the West ate well. Germans in the East did not. Germans in the West rebuilt their cities. Germans in the East lived under occupation. The division of Germany became a living laboratory of competing ideologies, and the results were unambiguous. The chocolate bar given to a prisoner in January 1945 was, in a sense, the first installment of the Marshall Plan. It was a demonstration that America had enough resources, enough confidence, enough generosity to help even its enemies. And that demonstration, repeated millions of times in thousands of interactions, helped to win the peace as surely as military power had won the war. There is a photograph taken in May 1945 that captures this transformation. It shows a group of German prisoners of war sitting in a field in Bavaria, waiting to be processed. They are dirty, exhausted, visibly malnourished, but they are smiling. In the foreground, one young soldier holds a can of American rations, examining it with an expression of disbelief. Behind him, an American guard leans against a truck, smoking a cigarette, his rifle slung casually over his shoulder. The photograph was never widely published. It is not iconic like the raising of the flag at Iwo Jima or the kiss in Times Square, but it tells a story as important as any of the famous images of the war. The story of how an empire built on lies crumbled in the face of ordinary decency. The soldier holding the can is unnamed. We do not know what happened to him. Perhaps he returned to Germany and built a quiet life. Perhaps he became one of the millions who rebuilt their country from the ashes. Perhaps he told his children and grandchildren about the day the Americans gave him food, and perhaps they did not believe him at first. because it sounded too good to be true. But it was true, and that truth mattered. In the decades after the war, historians debated the causes of Germany's defeat. Some pointed to strategic errors. The invasion of the Soviet Union, the failure to secure oil supplies, the dispersion of forces across too many fronts. Others emphasized material factors. The overwhelming industrial capacity of the United States, the Allied air campaign that shattered German infrastructure, the mathematical inevitability of attrition. But there was another factor, less quantifiable but no less important: the failure of ideology. The Nazi regime built its power on a foundation of lies. It told Germans that they were superior, that their enemies were subhuman, that conquest would bring prosperity and security. And for a time, those lies seemed to work. Germany conquered much of Europe. German soldiers believed they were invincible. But lies, no matter how persuasive, eventually collide with reality. And when they do, they shatter. The reality was that the Americans were not weak. The reality was that democracy could fight. The reality was that a nation built on individual liberty and economic opportunity could mobilize resources and manpower on a scale that the totalitarian Reich could never match. And the reality was that kindness, far from being a weakness, was a form of strength that the Nazis could neither understand nor counter. Every chocolate bar given to a prisoner was a small crack in the edifice of fascist ideology. Every meal served, every wound bandaged, every moment of basic human decency chipped away at the lies. And when the lies collapsed, what remained was not the master race, not the 1,000-year Reich, but ordinary men who had been lied to and who now had to decide what kind of people they wanted to be. Many chose to be better. Obergefreiter Klaus Hartmann survived the war. He was released from American custody in 1946 and returned to Lübeck, where he found his city in ruins and his family scattered. His mother had died in an air raid. His sister had fled east and was lost. He worked as a laborer, then as a clerk, slowly rebuilding a life from fragments. In 1948, he married a woman named Anna, a nurse who had worked in a military hospital during the war. They had 3 children. He rarely spoke about his experiences as a soldier, but he kept the wrapper from the chocolate bar, pressed flat and stored in a book. Occasionally, his children would find it and ask what it was. He would tell them, briefly, about the day he was captured, the day he expected to die, and the day an American soldier gave him chocolate instead. "Why did you keep it?" his daughter asked once. He thought for a long time before answering. "Because it reminds me that the world is not what I was taught it was, that people are not what I was told they were, and that even in the darkest moments there can be grace." He did not use the word grace lightly. He had been raised Lutheran, though the Nazis had done their best to supplant Christianity with their own pagan mythology. The concept of grace, unearned, undeserved mercy, had always been abstract to him. But in that moment, in the snow, with the chocolate in his hand, it had become real. Grace was the only word that fit. The story of German prisoners of war and their encounter with American kindness is not a story of redemption earned. Redemption cannot be earned. It can only be given. The men who fought for the Third Reich bore responsibility for their actions, for the suffering they inflicted, for the evil they served. Some understood this, some did not, but whether they understood or not, they were treated with a basic level of humanity that their own regime had denied to millions. This was not because they deserved it. It was because the Americans chose to uphold a principle even when it was difficult, even when it was costly, even when the enemy had shown no such mercy. That choice had consequences. It saved lives. It changed minds. It helped to build a post-war order in which former enemies became allies, in which democracy took root in soil that had seemed irredeemably poisoned. But the choice also had a moral dimension that transcended strategy. It was a declaration that even in war, even in the face of monstrous evil, it was possible to remain human, to see the enemy not as an abstraction but as individuals who could be reached, who could be changed, who could perhaps be saved. This is not to minimize the crimes of the Third Reich or to absolve those who participated in them. Justice demanded accountability, and accountability came in the form of trials, executions, and long incarcerations. But justice also demanded that the cycle of violence end somewhere, that at some point, the work of healing begin. The chocolate bar was not justice, but it was a beginning. In the final analysis, the defeat of Nazi Germany was not simply a military victory. It was a victory of ideas. The Allies did not just destroy the Wehrmacht. They discredited the ideology that the Wehrmacht represented. And they did so not only through force of arms, but through the power of example. The soldiers who gave chocolate to prisoners, who fed the hungry, who treated the wounded, who refused to descend into the barbarism of their enemies. These soldiers demonstrated that the democratic ideals for which the Allies claimed to fight were not empty rhetoric. They were real, they were practiced, they were worth defending, and the prisoners who received that chocolate, who tasted that kindness, who returned home with stories of a different kind of society, they became witnesses to the possibility of change. They became living proof that totalitarianism was not inevitable, that people could choose another path, that the future did not have to resemble the past. This is the legacy of those small, ordinary acts of decency, not the grand strategies or the decisive battles, but the moments when one human being chose to see another human being and act accordingly. The war ended more than 3/4 of a century ago. The soldiers who fought it are nearly all gone. The prisoners who were fed and freed have passed into history. But the lesson remains. Kindness is not weakness. Generosity is not naivete. And the willingness to extend humanity to those who do not deserve it is not sentimentality. It is the foundation of a just and lasting peace. The Nazi regime believed that power came from domination, that strength required cruelty, that the future belonged to those willing to be ruthless. They were wronged. Power without compassion is brittle. Strength without mercy is hollow. And a future built on hatred is no future at all. The chocolate bar, melting slowly in the hand of a young German soldier on a frozen Belgian hillside, was a small thing, but it contained within it the seed of a larger truth. That abundance shared is stronger than scarcity hoarded, that trust built is more enduring than fear imposed, and that the simple act of feeding an enemy can accomplish what 1,000 propaganda films cannot. It can change a mind, it can open a heart, it can destroy an ideology, and in the end, that is how wars are truly won. Epilogue: the snow has long since melted. The barbed wire has rusted into dust. The camps have been dismantled. The fields returned to farmers, the roads rebuilt. The men who gave and received that chocolate are gone, their stories preserved only in archives and fading memories. But the principle endures. In every generation, in every conflict, the question arises: how do we treat those we have defeated? Do we mirror their cruelty, or do we rise above it? Do we see them as enemies forever, or as human beings capable of change? The answer matters. It shapes not only the aftermath of war, but the character of peace. It determines whether victory breeds reconciliation or resentment, whether former foes become friends, or the seeds of future conflict are sown. The American soldiers who offered chocolate to German prisoners did not think they were changing history. They were simply doing what they had been taught to do, following the values they had been raised with, acting on an instinct toward decency that totalitarian regimes cannot erase. But in those small acts, they demonstrated the power of a free society. Not the power to destroy, though that was considerable, but the power to heal, to rebuild, to transform enemies into allies. That is the true victory, not the battles won or the territory captured, but the world remade. And it began, in part, with a chocolate bar, a small, sweet symbol of abundance in a time of scarcity, a gesture of grace in a moment of despair, a reminder, passed from hand to hand across the frozen wasteland of war, that even when everything else is lost, humanity remains. That lesson, hard-won and paid for in blood, is the inheritance of all who came after. May we never forget it.